Trigger warning. This video contains graphic descriptions of racial violence and discrimination that may be disturbing to some viewers. Welcome to our channel where we uncover the raw, unfiltered stories of racism that have shaped lives and scarred communities. Today, we dive into a chilling tale from 1980s Mississippi. A story of betrayal, violence, and a community's silence that allowed injustice to fester. This is the story of Marcus Tate, a young black man whose dreams were shattered by the brutality of prejudice. If you're moved by these stories and want to join us in shedding light on these hidden truths, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Let's get started. The Cost of Silence. Jackson, Mississippi, August 1983. The air in Jackson was thick with the late summer heat, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. Marcus Tate, a 24-year-old mechanic's apprentice, wiped the sweat from his brow as he walked home from the auto shop on Farish Street. His hands were still stained with grease, his faded blue overalls clinging to his frame after a long day. Marcus was known in his neighborhood for his quiet ambition. He dreamed of opening his own repair shop one day, a place where he could build a legacy for his family. But in 1983, in a city still scarred by the wounds of segregation, dreams like Marcus's were fragile, easily crushed under the weight of a world that refused to see him as equal. Marcus lived in a modest shotgun house on Lynch Street with his mother, Evelyn Tate, and his younger sister, Latoya, who was just 16. The Tates were a tight-knit family, grounded by Evelyn's faith and her unyielding belief that hard work could carve a path through even the darkest times. Evelyn had lived through the civil rights movement, had marched with Dr. King's supporters in '63 and carried the stories of those days like battle scars. She'd always told Marcus, "Keep your head down, son, but never let them steal your pride." It was advice born of survival, but it couldn't shield him from what was coming. On the evening of August 12, 1983, Marcus's life would change forever. It started with a simple errand. Evelyn had asked him to pick up a few groceries from Harper's Market, a small store just a mile from their home. The market was one of the few places in Jackson where black and white residents shopped side by side, though the tension between them was palpable. The store's owner, Harold Harper, was a gruff man in his late 50s, known for his curt demeanor with black customers. Marcus had been there countless times, always careful to keep his interactions brief and polite. That night, as Marcus entered the store, he noticed a group of white teenagers lingering near the counter. They were loud, their laughter sharp and mocking, their eyes following him as he moved through the aisles. Marcus ignored them, grabbing a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a bag of sugar. At the counter, Harper rang up his items slowly, his gaze flickering between Marcus and the teenagers. $5.20, Harper muttered, barely looking up. Marcus handed over a crumpled $5 bill and a quarter, but as Harper took the money, one of the teenagers, a lanky boy with a buzz cut named Tommy Wheeler, spoke up. "Hey Harper, you sure he didn't steal that money? You know how they are." The other boy snickered. Marcus froze, his jaw tightening. He'd heard comments like this before, but something about the way Tommy said it, the casual venom in his voice, set his nerves on edge. "I earned this money," Marcus said quietly, his eyes fixed on Harper. "Same as anybody." Harper didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Tommy and shrugged. "You boys behave now." It was a dismissal, but it felt like permission. As Marcus left the store, the group followed him. He quickened his pace, the grocery bag heavy in his arms, but the sound of their footsteps grew closer. The street was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Marcus's heart pounded, but he kept his head forward, remembering his mother's words. "Keep your head down." He didn't see the first blow coming. A fist slammed into the back of his head, sending him stumbling forward. The grocery bag fell, the milk carton bursting open on the ground. Before he could recover, another blow landed, this time a kick to his ribs. Marcus fell to his knees, gasping as the teenagers surrounded him. "Think you're better than us, huh?" Tommy sneered, his voice thick with rage. "Coming into our store acting like you belong!" The others joined in, their fists and boots raining down on Marcus's body. He tried to shield his face, but the pain was overwhelming. A sharp crack in his ribs, a burning in his lungs. He tasted blood, felt it trickle from his nose. The attack seemed to last forever, though it was likely only a minute or two. Finally, Tommy stepped back, spitting on the ground next to Marcus. "Stay out of our neighborhood," he said. "Next time you won't walk away." The boys disappeared into the night, their laughter echoing down the street. Marcus lay there for a moment, his body screaming in pain, before dragging himself to his feet. He stumbled home, leaving the groceries behind. When Evelyn saw him, her face crumpled. She cleaned his wounds in silence, her hands trembling as she dabbed at the cuts on his face. "We need to go to the police," LaToya said, her voice shaking with anger. Marcus shook his head. "They won't do nothing, Toya. You know that." He was right. In Jackson, like much of the South in the early 80s, the police were often complicit in the silence that surrounded racial violence. Complaints from black residents were dismissed, investigations stalled, and perpetrators rarely faced consequences. Evelyn knew this too, but she couldn't let it go. The next morning, against Marcus's wishes, she marched to the Jackson Police Department and filed a report. She named Tommy Wheeler, whose family was well known in the area, and described the other boys as best she could based on Marcus's account. The officer behind the desk, a middle-aged man named Sergeant Robert Klein, listened with a bored expression. "We'll look into it, ma'am," he said, scribbling a few notes. "But you know how these things go. Boys will be boys." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "My son was nearly killed. That's not boys being boys. That's a crime." Klein shrugged. "We'll do what we can." What they did was nothing. Days turned into weeks, and no one from the police department followed up. Marcus's injuries healed slowly. A fractured rib, a concussion, and bruises that lingered for weeks. But the deeper wounds were invisible. He stopped going to Harper's Market, started taking longer routes to avoid certain streets. His dream of opening a repair shop felt further away, buried under the weight of fear and humiliation. The Tate family wasn't alone in their struggle. Jackson in the 1980s was a city divided, where the progress of the civil rights movement had left a fragile veneer of equality. Black residents faced discrimination in housing, employment, and education, often with no recourse. Incidents like Marcus's were common, whispered about in churches and barbershops but rarely reported. The fear of retaliation, from police, from neighbors, from the system itself, kept many silent. But silence has a cost. For Marcus, it was his sense of safety, his belief in a future where he could thrive. For Evelyn, it was the realization that the world she'd fought for was still out of reach for her children. And for LaToya, it was a growing anger, a fire that would eventually lead her to become an activist in her own right. The attack on Marcus wasn't the end of the story. Tommy Wheeler and his friends, emboldened by the lack of consequences, continued their reign of intimidation in the neighborhood. In November 1983, they targeted another black resident, a 19-year-old named Jamal Carter, who worked as a busboy at a local diner. Jamal wasn't as lucky as Marcus. The beating he endured left him in a coma for 3 weeks. When he woke, he could no longer walk without a cane. Jamal's case finally drew attention, not because of the police, but because of a small group of activists led by a pastor named Reverend Clarence Boone. Boone had been organizing in Jackson for years, documenting cases of racial violence and pushing for accountability. He rallied the community, organizing protests outside the police station and demanding justice for Jamal and others like him. Evelyn joined the protests, carrying a sign that read, "No more silence." Marcus, still haunted by his own attack, hesitated to get involved. He feared retaliation, not just from Tommy's crew, but from the broader system that seemed to protect them. But LaToya's persistence wore him down. "If we don't speak up, who will?" she asked him one night. "They're counting on us to stay quiet." In January 1984, Marcus agreed to share his story at a community meeting organized by Reverend Boone. The room was packed with familiar faces, neighbors, church members, and others who had their own stories of injustice. As Marcus spoke, his voice trembled at first, but grew stronger. He described the attack, the pain, the fear that had followed him ever since. He named Tommy Wheeler, unafraid of the consequences for the first time. The meeting was a turning point. Other victims came forward, their stories painting a picture of a community under siege. Reverend Boone used the momentum to pressure the police department, threatening to take the cases to the press. Finally, in March 1984, Tommy Wheeler and two of his friends were arrested, not for Marcus's attack, but for Jamal's. The charges were assault and battery, and though the sentences were light, 6 months in juvenile detention for Tommy, probation for the others, it was a rare victory. For Marcus, it wasn't enough. The arrests didn't erase the scars, physical or emotional, but they did give him something he hadn't felt in months, a flicker of hope. He began working with Reverend Boone's group, helping to document other cases and support victims. His dream of opening a repair shop never faded, but it took on a new purpose, to create a space where his community could feel safe, respected, and valued. Evelyn watched her son's transformation with a mix of pride and sorrow. She knew the road ahead would be long, that the silence of others, the police, the store owners, the neighbors who looked the other way, was a barrier they'd have to keep fighting. But she also saw the strength in Marcus and LaToya, in the community that was finally finding its voice. The cost of silence had been high, but the cost of speaking out was higher still. It demanded courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to face the ugliness of a world that wasn't ready to change. For Marcus Tate, it was a price he was willing to pay. Jackson, Mississippi, April 1984. The spring of 1984 brought a deceptive calm to Jackson. The dogwood trees bloomed along Lynch Street, their white petals a stark contrast to the tension that still simmered beneath the surface. For Marcus Tate, the past 8 months had been a battle, not just to heal his body, but to reclaim the parts of himself that the attack on August 12, 1983 had stolen. The arrests of Tommy Wheeler and his accomplices in March had been a small victory, but it came with a price. Whispers followed Marcus wherever he went. Some in the neighborhood praised his courage for speaking out. Others, fearful of retaliation, urged him to stay quiet. Marcus, now 25, had returned to his job at the auto shop on Farish Street, but the work felt different. His hands, once steady and sure, trembled when he heard loud voices outside. His boss, Mr. Ellis, a grizzled black man who'd seen his share of trouble, noticed the change. "You gotta keep moving, Marcus," he'd say. "Don't let 'em win by making you afraid." But fear was a stubborn shadow, and it clung to Marcus like the Mississippi humidity. At home, the Tate family was fracturing under the strain. Evelyn, Marcus's mother, threw herself into Reverend Boone's activist group, attending meetings and organizing fundraisers for victims of racial violence. Her faith remained her anchor, but her eyes carried a new weariness. LaToya, Marcus's 16-year-old sister, was different. Her anger had hardened into defiance. She'd started skipping school to join protests, her notebook filled with poems about justice and rage. Marcus worried about her, but he couldn't find the words to reach her. The attack had changed them all, and the silence between them grew louder each day. The first sign of trouble came in late April. Marcus was locking up the auto shop one evening when he noticed a pickup truck idling across the street. Its headlights were off, but he could make out 2 figures inside. He recognized the truck. It belonged to Bobby Wheeler, Tommy's older brother, a 27-year-old known for his temper and his loyalty to his family. Bobby hadn't been involved in the attack, but his presence now felt like a warning. Marcus hurried home, his heart racing, but the truck didn't follow. A week later, the warning became a threat. On May 3, 1984, Marcus found a note slipped under the door of the Tates' house. Scrawled in jagged handwriting, it read, "You snitched. You'll pay." Evelyn wanted to take it to the police, but Marcus stopped her. "They didn't help last time," he said. "What makes you think they will now?" Instead, he burned the note in the backyard, watching the flames curl around the words. But the message lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that the Wheelers hadn't forgotten. The retaliation came swiftly. On May 15, 1984, as Marcus walked home from a community meeting, a group of men ambushed him near Bailey Avenue. There were 3 of them, their faces partially covered with bandanas. Marcus recognized Bobby Wheeler's voice immediately. "You thought you could ruin my brother's life and walk away?" Bobby hissed, his fist slamming into Marcus's stomach. The others joined in, their blows precise and merciless. This time, Marcus fought back, landing a punch that bloodied one attacker's nose, but he was outnumbered. The assault left him with a broken wrist and a gash above his eye that required stitches. When Marcus stumbled home, Evelyn called Reverend Boone instead of the police. Boone arrived with 2 other activists, their faces grim. "This isn't just about you anymore, Marcus," Boone said. "They're sending a message to all of us." He urged Marcus to leave Jackson, at least for a while, but Marcus refused. "This is my home," he said, his voice raw. "I'm not running." Latoya, overhearing the conversation, exploded. "You're not running, but you're not fighting either. You're just taking it, Marcus. When's it gonna stop?" Her words cut deeper than the blows he'd endured. Marcus didn't have an answer. Not for her, not for himself. The summer of 1984 was a turning point for Jackson's black community. Reverend Boone's group, now called the Justice Coalition, gained traction, drawing attention from local newspapers and even a few national reporters. They organized a march in June, demanding accountability for racial violence. Over 200 people joined, including Marcus, who walked with a limp from his injuries. Latoya carried a sign that read, "Our Lives Matter," a phrase that felt both timeless and urgent. The march was peaceful, but the police presence was heavy, their batons at the ready. For a moment, it seemed like change was possible. But hope in Jackson was a fragile thing, easily shattered. On July 22, 1984, tragedy struck. Jamal Carter, the young man who'd been left disabled after his attack the previous year, was found dead in his apartment. The official report called it a suicide, an overdose of pain medication, but the community didn't believe it. Jamal had been vocal about his case, testifying against Tommy Wheeler and refusing to stay silent. Rumors swirled that the Wheelers or their allies had gotten to him, a warning to others who dared to speak out. Jamal's death broke something in Marcus. He'd met Jamal a few times at Boone's meetings, had seen the fire in his eyes despite his injuries. Now that fire was gone, and Marcus couldn't shake the guilt. If I'd stayed quiet, would he still be alive? The question haunted him, gnawing at his resolve. Evelyn saw her son slipping away. One night, as they sat at the kitchen table, she took his hand. "You're carrying too much, Marcus," she said. "This fight ain't just yours. Let us carry some of it." Her words were a lifeline, but Marcus wasn't sure he could hold on. The betrayal came in August. Marcus had confided in a co-worker, a man named Darrell Sims, about the threats from the Wheelers. Darrell was a friend, or so Marcus thought, someone who'd shared his own stories of discrimination. But Darrell had debts, and debts made him desperate. Unknown to Marcus, Darrell had been approached by Bobby Wheeler with an offer: information for cash. On August 10, 1984, Darrell told Bobby about Marcus's plans to testify at a city council meeting about police inaction. The consequences were immediate. On August 12th, the one-year anniversary of the first attack, Marcus was targeted again. This time, it wasn't a beating. As he left the auto shop, a Molotov cocktail shattered through the shop's window, setting the front office ablaze. Marcus escaped, but the fire destroyed half the building. Mr. Ellis, devastated, had no choice but to lay Marcus off. The police called it vandalism with no suspects. Marcus knew better. The fire was a breaking point. Marcus felt the walls closing in. The Wheelers' reach, the community's fear, his own powerlessness. Latoya, now 17, begged him to fight back, to join the coalition's next protest. But Marcus was tired, his dreams of a repair shop reduced to ash. For the first time, he considered leaving Jackson, leaving the fight, leaving everything. But leaving wasn't an option. On September 5, 1984, Latoya disappeared. She'd been at a coalition meeting, planning a vigil for Jamal. When she didn't come home, Evelyn called Marcus, her voice trembling. They searched all night, checking every place Latoya might be. At dawn, Marcus found her shoes near a vacant lot on Bailey Avenue, the same street where he'd been attacked. His heart sank. The police were slow to respond, dismissing Latoya as a runaway. Reverend Boone mobilized the coalition, organizing search parties and pressuring the authorities. Marcus barely slept, his days consumed with searching, his nights plagued by nightmares. On September 8th, a tip led them to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Inside, they found LaToya, battered but alive. She'd been taken by two men, hired by Bobby Wheeler, she said, who'd held her for days, warning her to stop her activism. LaToya's return was a miracle, but it came with a cost. She was quieter now, her fire dimmed. Marcus blamed himself, convinced his decision to speak out had put her in danger. Evelyn, torn between relief and rage, vowed to keep fighting, but Marcus could see the toll it was taking on her. The warehouse incident finally forced the police to act. On September 15, 1984, Bobby Wheeler was arrested, along with two associates. The charges included kidnapping and assault, serious enough to keep them behind bars pending trial. For Marcus, it was a hollow victory. The damage was done. To LaToya, to his family, to the community that lived in fear. By early 1985, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't stay in Jackson, not because he was running, but because he needed to heal. With Evelyn's blessing, he moved to Atlanta, where a cousin offered him a job at a garage. LaToya stayed with Evelyn, finishing high school and slowly finding her voice again through poetry. The Justice Coalition continued its work, and though the Wheelers' influence waned, the scars they'd left remained. Marcus's story didn't end in Atlanta. The pain he carried, the lessons he learned, shaped him into a man who refused to stay silent. Years later, he'd returned to Jackson, not as a victim, but as a mentor, helping young people navigate a world still marred by prejudice. But that's a story for another time. Jackson, Mississippi, June 1995. The Jackson skyline hadn't changed much in the decade since Marcus Tate left. The same tired buildings lined Capitol Street, their faded paint a testament to a city caught between past and present. But for Marcus, now 36, stepping off the Greyhound bus on a muggy June morning felt like walking into a memory he'd tried to bury. He carried a duffel bag over one shoulder and a weight in his chest that hadn't lifted in 10 years. Atlanta had given him a fresh start. A steady job at a garage, a small apartment, a life free from the constant threat of violence. But Jackson was home, and home had a way of calling you back. Marcus had returned for two reasons. The first was his sister, LaToya, now 27, and a rising voice in Mississippi's activist circles. She'd spent the last decade turning her pain into purpose, writing poetry and organizing with the Justice Coalition, the same group Reverend Boone had led until his death in 1990. LaToya had written to Marcus, asking him to come home and help her open a community center in their old neighborhood. The second reason was his own dream, one he'd clung to through every setback, to open an auto repair shop, a place where he could build something lasting. Evelyn, their mother, was waiting at the bus station. At 58, her hair was streaked with gray, her face etched with lines from years of worry and resilience. She hugged Marcus tightly, her voice soft but firm. "You sure about this, son? This city don't forget." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure. Jackson held ghosts. The attack in 1983, the fire at the auto shop, LaToya's kidnapping. But he was tired of running from them. The Tate family settled back into their old house on Lynch Street, which Evelyn had kept standing through sheer will. LaToya lived nearby in a small apartment filled with books and protest flyers. She'd grown into a woman Marcus barely recognized, fierce, articulate, unafraid. But he saw the shadows in her eyes, the same ones he carried. The warehouse incident in 1984 had left scars that time couldn't erase. Marcus's first weeks back were quiet. He found a small garage for rent on Farish Street, not far from his old workplace, and began fixing it up. He worked long hours, sanding floors and repairing the roof, pouring his savings into the dream he'd held for over a decade. The community noticed, neighbors stopped by, offering tools or a kind word. A few remembered him from the 80s, their smiles tinged with respect. "You're back to show 'em, huh?" an old man named Mr. Jenkins said one day. Marcus just shrugged. He wasn't here to prove anything. He just wanted to build. But Jackson wasn't done with its old grudges. On July 10, 1995, Marcus received a visit at the garage. Bobby Wheeler, now 38, stood in the doorway, his frame heavier but his eyes just as cold. Bobby had served 3 years for LaToya's kidnapping and emerged angrier, his family's influence in Jackson diminished but not gone. "Heard you were back," Bobby said, his voice low. "Thought you'd learned your lesson." Marcus gripped a wrench, his pulse quickening. "I ain't looking for trouble, Bobby. Just trying to live." Bobby smirked. "This ain't your town no more. You should have stayed gone." He left without another word, but the threat hung in the air. Marcus didn't tell Evelyn or LaToya. He didn't want to worry them, not when they were already stretched thin. Trouble followed soon after. On July 18th, someone slashed the tires of every car parked outside Marcus's garage. A week later, graffiti appeared on the walls. "Go back to Atlanta." Marcus reported it to the police, but the officer, a young white man named Deputy Paul Grayson, barely took notes. "Kids, probably," Grayson said, his tone dismissive. Marcus knew better. The Wheelers were sending a message, just like they had a decade ago. LaToya, meanwhile, was facing her own battles. The Justice Coalition had grown, but so had the resistance. Local businesses, many owned by white families with ties to the old guard, refused to sponsor the community center. Anonymous threats arrived at LaToya's apartment. Letters, phone calls, even a brick through her window. She brushed them off, but Marcus saw the strain. "You don't have to do this alone," he told her one night. LaToya shook her head. "If I stop, they win." The community center opened on August 12, 1995, exactly 12 years after Marcus's first attack. It was a small victory, celebrated with a block party that drew hundreds. LaToya spoke to the crowd, her voice steady as she honored Jamal Carter, Reverend Boone, and others lost to the fight. Marcus watched from the sidelines, pride swelling in his chest. For a moment, it felt like they were winning, but victory was fleeting. On August 20th, Marcus's garage was vandalized again. This time, the windows smashed, tools stolen, and oil poured across the floor. The damage cost thousands, money Marcus didn't have. He worked through the night to clean it up, refusing to let Evelyn or LaToya see him break, but the weight was crushing. "Why did I come back?" he wondered, his hands stained with oil and despair. The final blow came in September. Evelyn, who'd been quietly battling heart problems, collapsed at home on September 5, 1995. Marcus and LaToya rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors were blunt. Years of stress had taken their toll. Evelyn died 2 days later on September 7th at the age of 58. Her last words to Marcus were, "Keep going, son. Don't let them take your heart." Evelyn's death shattered the Tates. LaToya threw herself into the coalition, her grief fueling her activism. Marcus, however, withdrew. He stopped work on the garage, spent days staring at the walls of the house that no longer felt like home. The community rallied around them, bringing food and prayers, but Marcus felt alone. He blamed himself for coming back, for stirring up old wounds, for not protecting his family. The turning point came in October. LaToya organized a memorial for Evelyn, held at the community center. Hundreds attended, sharing stories of Evelyn's kindness, her courage, her faith. A young woman named Keisha, who'd been mentored by LaToya, approached Marcus after the service. "Your mom saved me," she said. "She told me I could be more than this city wanted me to be. You gotta keep her fight alive." Keisha's words echoed Evelyn's last plea. Marcus realized he couldn't let her death be another loss to silence. He returned to the garage, working harder than ever. By December 1995, Tate's Auto Repair opened its doors. It was small, imperfect, but it was his. The community showed up, not just for repairs, but for a place to gather, to feel safe. Marcus hired 2 young men from the neighborhood, teaching them the trade, giving them what he'd once dreamed of for himself. Bobby Wheeler tried one last time to intimidate Marcus, showing up at the garage in January 1996. But this time, Marcus wasn't alone. Neighbors, customers, even some of LaToya's activists stood with him. Bobby left, his threats empty. The Wheelers' grip on Jackson was slipping, their name no longer enough to instill fear. Marcus's fight wasn't over. Racism in Jackson took new forms, redlining, underfunded schools, police profiling, but he faced it differently now, with a community behind him and his mother's voice in his heart. LaToya's community center thrived, a beacon for the next generation. And Marcus, once a victim of silence, became a voice for those still finding theirs. Marcus Tate's story is a reminder that the fight against racism is never easy, but it's always worth it. If his journey moved you, if it made you think, please subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon. LaToya's community center thrived, a beacon for the next generation. And Marcus, once a victim of silence, became a voice for those still finding theirs.